July 1977. Somewhere on the English summer polo circuit, a press photographer captures a young woman watching from the stands. She is 22 years old, composed, well-dressed, entirely at ease in surroundings she has known since birth. The caption on the archive photograph reads, "The Prince loses. Prince Charles lost his polo match despite being cheered on by Lady Sarah Spencer, 22-year-old daughter of Earl Spencer." That caption tells you almost everything about where this story begins. The woman in that photograph isn't a newcomer to this world. She was born inside it, literally. Elizabeth Sarah Lavinia Spencer arrived on 19 March 1955 at Park House, Sandringham. Not near the royal estate, not adjacent to it, on it. The house her family rented sat on Queen Elizabeth II's own grounds. Her father, John Spencer, then styled Viscount Althorp, had spent the preceding 4 years attending to the crown in a formal household capacity. Equerry to King George VI from 1950 to 1952, then equerry to Queen Elizabeth II from 1952 to 1954. An equerry isn't a social acquaintance. He attends the sovereign at official engagements and in the rhythms of daily life, a role that requires daily proximity, personal trust, and the kind of access that isn't given to people on the social periphery. Sarah's godmother was Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The Spencer family traces documented genealogical descents from the House of Stuart, multiple bloodlines from James I and Charles I, recorded in specialist peerage references and acknowledged by people whose professional function is exactly this kind of reckoning. A consultant to Burke's Peerage told Time magazine in a retrospective on the Spencer family, "There can't be another family so stiff with royal connections." Spencer House in London, built in the 18th century by John Spencer, was the work of the great-grandson of Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, the woman who had been Queen Anne's most powerful favorite. The family had been embedded in royal politics since the reign of the Stuarts. They weren't climbing toward the monarchy, they were part of the furniture of it. When John Spencer inherited the earldom as 8th Earl Spencer in June 1975 on the death of his father, his eldest daughter formally acquired the title she is still known by, Lady Sarah Spencer. Prior to that, as the daughter of a viscount, she would have been styled the Honorable Sarah Spencer. The distinction matters. By 1977, she was Lady Sarah Spencer, eldest daughter of an earl whose family had been in formal royal household service within living memory, born on the Sandringham estate with the Queen Mother as her godparent, educated at Riddlesworth Hall School in Norfolk and then Westheath Girls' School near Sevenoaks in Kent, two of the most thoroughly aristocratic boarding schools available to a girl of her generation. The same two schools her younger sister Diana would later attend. So when, in the summer of 1977, the Prince of Wales began spending time with Lady Sarah Spencer, it required no translation within the relevant social circles. He was 29, heir to the throne, under increasing pressure from his father and his advisors to resolve the long-standing question of marriage. She was 22, eldest daughter of an earl with direct royal household service and a godmother who had watched 2 monarchs die. Every credential pointed in the right direction. They were introduced at the annual Royal Ascot House Party at Windsor, according to Tatler's account of the relationship. From that meeting, the courtship developed through the summer. Tina Brown, in the Diana Chronicles, describes Sarah enjoying the prince squiring her around and receiving what Brown characterizes as a flattering stream of invitations to Windsor and Balmoral. By July, there were press photographs, the polo match, the stands, the archive image that would survive the relationship by decades. The paparazzi were watching, writing, speculating. The palace made no official acknowledgement, but it never needed to. In this particular social world, being photographed together at Windsor Polo in summer 1977 was acknowledgement enough. By November of that year, the relationship had advanced to the point where Charles accepted an invitation to Althorp, the Spencer family's ancestral estate in Northamptonshire. He came as Sarah's companion. Somewhere during that visit, in one of the rooms of the family home, He encountered Diana Spencer for the first time properly, face to face, not in passing. She was 16 years old. She would later recall being a shy 16-year-old at the time. Charles, per Brown's account, registered her not as a candidate, not as a complication, but as a jolly and bouncy younger sister of the woman he was there for. He noticed her the way you notice a room you're passing through. It would take him 3 more years to notice her differently. To understand what Sarah Spencer was walking into during those months, you need a clear picture of what Charles's emotional life actually looked like in 1977. He had first encountered Camilla Shand in 1971. She was 23, he was 22. According to Time magazine's 2005 account of their history, Camilla reportedly opened their first conversation by noting that her great-grandmother had been the mistress of his great-great-grandfather and suggesting the tradition might continue. Whether that opening line is apocryphal or genuine, what followed wasn't. They fell for each other in a way that Charles had not experienced with anyone else. His family was against a match. Camilla wasn't considered a suitable future queen. She had a louche ancestor, as Time phrased it, and she lacked the requisite presentation of innocence. Charles failed to propose. In 1973, Camilla married his friend Andrew Parker Bowles. By all biographical accounts available, the loss cut deeply. Charles carried an emotional weight toward Camilla through her marriage and into the years that followed. Jonathan Dimbleby, in his 1994 authorized biography drawn from Charles's own journals, diaries, and letters, describes what Camilla represented to Charles as the warmth, the understanding, and the steadiness for which he had always longed and had never been able to find with any other person. Penny Junor, whose research on the Charles-Diana period is among the most carefully constructed available, is more specific in her account of why Camilla's appeal endured. Camilla's husband, unfortunately, was very unfaithful to her, so she was very lonesome in her marriage, and Charles made her feel good. The timeline of what happened next is precise and bears directly on Sarah Spencer's experience. Junor places the physical resumption of the Charles-Camilla affair around 1978. Dimbleby's authorized biography is consistent, stating the romance resumed in the late 1970s and ended only when he became engaged to Lady Diana Spencer. The structure of Sarah's time with Charles maps onto this precisely. The courtship runs from summer 1977 to early 1978. The Charles-Camilla affair resumes around the same period. The Sarah-Charles relationship ends in early 1978. There is no documented record of Sarah identifying Camilla as a factor in her own thinking about the relationship. The historical record does not give us her private reckoning on this specific point. What it gives us is the architecture of the situation. A man under intense institutional pressure to find a wife, emotionally bonded to a married woman he couldn't publicly acknowledge, who needed the formal arrangement of marriage to provide a function that his actual emotional life couldn't accommodate. Whether Sarah named that architecture explicitly or encountered it through temperament and social intelligence, her behavior in early 1978 would demonstrate she wasn't operating under illusions about what was on offer. The institutional pressure surrounding Charles in this period was substantial and well documented. Lord Mountbatten had reportedly urged Charles in correspondence to find a suitable, attractive, and sweet-charactered young woman before she had fallen for him. Language that functioned, in the coded grammar of that world, as a recommendation for someone who wouldn't bring complications with her. Prince Philip had been pressing his son toward marriage in writing. Dimbleby's authorized biography is direct about how Charles experienced these pressures. Major life decisions about school, university, the armed forces had been taken for him by his father or by Mountbatten or by committees of the great and the good, all of whom went through the forms of consultation but took his compliance for granted. The marriage search was proceeding on the same terms. The list of criteria, as Junor later articulated them plainly, was short and specific: a virgin, an aristocrat, and a member of the Church of England. Only the last of these had any legal force. A Catholic queen consort remained legally prohibited at the time. The virginity requirement had no constitutional basis, as Vanity Fair's 2011 analysis of the subject confirmed explicitly. It was a powerful informal standard enforced by courtiers, by the palace's cultural expectations, by the press, and by decades of accumulated convention. It operated as if it were law because, in the relevant social circles, deviation from it had no upside and significant downside. By 1977, with Charles in his late 20s and the bride pool narrowing with every passing year, the informal criteria had acquired a certain desperation. Juner would later note that, by the 1980s, after the 1960s sexual revolution and the introduction of the contraceptive pill, there were very few aristocratic virgins around, and as time went by, Charles was by this point in his 30s, they were getting fewer and fewer. What the palace needed was a candidate from the right family, with the right affiliations, who had managed to reach her early 20s without accumulating a visible history. Lady Sarah Spencer was an aristocrat with an impeccable bloodline and a godmother who was the Queen Mother. She ticked the first column with authority. But she was also 22 years old, had lived a full social life in London after leaving West Heath, and, as events at a ski resort in early 1978 would demonstrate, was constitutionally incapable of pretending otherwise. Early 1978. Klosters, Switzerland. A ski resort in the canton of Graubünden. Charles is on holiday, and Sarah is with him. At some point during the trip, she sits down to lunch with James Whittaker, identified by Vanity Fair's 1998 feature, Diana and the Press, as being, at that time, a reporter for The Sun. A second journalist, Nigel Nelson, was also present at the table, according to Tatler's account of the incident drawn from contemporary reporting. Two Fleet Street men at lunch with the Prince of Wales's girlfriend at a Swiss ski resort. In retrospect, the social arithmetic of the situation should have triggered more caution. It didn't. Whittaker described her afterward as disarmingly frank. Over the course of that lunch, Sarah Spencer spoke about herself with the kind of openness that the role she was being considered for specifically required its candidates not to possess. She spoke about having been diagnosed with anorexia. She spoke about a past problem with alcohol. She acknowledged what she characterized as thousands of boyfriends before Charles, a deliberately theatrical number, but the point wasn't the arithmetic. She mentioned that she had been keeping a scrapbook of press clippings about her royal romance, which she intended to show her future grandchildren someday. The scrapbook detail is telling. It suggests a woman who was treating her relationship with the heir to the throne as a chapter in her life, something to be documented and remembered, rather than as a destiny to be inhabited without comment. And then she stated a principle about marriage that the tabloid press would repeat in various versions for decades afterward. The most reliably sourced reconstruction of her words, appearing across multiple careful secondary accounts, renders it as, she wouldn't marry anyone she didn't love, whether he were the dustman or the King of England. That phrasing matters. The principle she stated was about love as a condition of marriage, not a verdict on Charles specifically. She wasn't saying she wouldn't marry him, she was saying she wouldn't marry without love, full stop, regardless of title, regardless of institutional pressure, regardless of who was asking. In 1978, for a woman in her precise social position, that statement was already extraordinary. The social world she inhabited had not positioned her to make it out loud to Fleet Street reporters. When the story ran in the British tabloid press, Charles saw it. According to the Wikipedia account of the incident, Sarah showed him the published article herself. His reaction, reported in Tatler's account of events drawing on Brown's research, was delivered coldly. "You've just done something extremely stupid." The relationship ended shortly after that. Multiple sources are consistent on a key point. It was Charles who ended it, not Sarah who walked away. Vanity Fair's 1998 feature frames it as Sarah having made the mistake of giving an interview to James Whittaker. Tatler's account notes that Sarah realized her mistake as soon as the words were out of her mouth and attempted some damage control, suggesting that Whitaker's interview had been obtained by foul means. Damage control that, the account adds, didn't play well. Whitaker himself, writing about the episode later as the Daily Mirror's royal editor, said her head seemed to have been turned by the publicity. The language everyone reached for was mistake. What Sarah had done was a mistake. She had made an error. She had miscalculated. She had been indiscreet. This framing, consistent across every source available, contains an embedded assumption worth examining directly. The assumption is that there existed a correct way for her to have behaved, that discretion was the obvious right answer, and that by speaking frankly she had failed some implicit standard. That framing was accurate, from the palace's perspective. She had failed its standard. She had demonstrated that she was the kind of person who would do this, who would sit at a cloister's lunch table and answer honestly when asked about her life. No other aristocratic woman documented in Charles's social circle had given comparable on-the-record remarks about the nature of her relationship with him. The social norm was absolute. You maintained total silence with the press about what happened near the crown. You didn't discuss his personality, his suitability as a partner, your feelings about the future. You didn't tell a reporter what conditions you would place on a marriage proposal. You kept the image intact and the speculation managed, and in return you remained in good standing with the institution that granted access. This wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. The consequences of deviation made the rule sufficiently clear. Sarah Spencer deviated once, at a lunch in Cloisters, and the machinery immediately produced its verdict. The important distinction, and the research makes this clear, is that her exit from the relationship wasn't strategic. The accounts available don't support a reading of Sarah as having engineered her departure through a calculated disclosure. She spoke the way she spoke, with the confidence of a woman from a certain background who had not yet fully reckoned with how completely the role she was being considered for required the suppression of that kind of confidence. Whitaker was charming company. The lunch was pleasant. The words came out. The article ran. The consequences followed. That the consequences were so swift and so absolute is the revealing part. Sarah didn't need to stage a protest or file a formal objection to the arrangement. She needed only to be herself, once, on the record. The machinery recoiled because what she had demonstrated wasn't that she had bad judgment. She had demonstrated that she was a person with an inner life she would discuss. In the palace's informal calculus, that was the disqualifier. In February 1981, when the engagement to Diana was announced, and reporters asked Sarah Spencer about her role in the story, she gave them a single line. "I introduce them," she said. "I'm Cupid." The self-deprecating wit is characteristic, but the line also sets the terms by which the establishment preferred to remember her involvement. As a matchmaker, a pleasant bridge figure, someone who had helped the story along. The alternative reading, that the woman who introduced Charles to Diana was the woman the palace had found too forthright to be useful, was available to anyone paying attention. The palace's criteria for a suitable bride, as they operated in the late 1970s, were never articulated in a single document. No memo survives listing the requirements in plain language. What survives is the pattern of behavior, the women who remained in consideration, and the women who were quietly removed from it, and the retrospective articulations of those closest to the process. Juner's formulation is as clean as any. It was thought Charles's bride must be a virgin, an aristocrat, and a member of the Church of England. 3 conditions. The Catholic prohibition was a legal requirement under the Act of Settlement. The virginity and aristocratic requirements were informal, enforced through social pressure and courtier convention, rather than constitutional law. Vanity Fair's 2011 analysis confirmed that Diana was portrayed as seemingly a virgin, and that this portrayal embodied precisely what Lord Mountbatten and others had urged Charles to find: aristocratic background, beauty, youth, and apparent innocence. The informal requirement was never only about sexual history in isolation. It was about the complete presentation of a woman whose personal life wouldn't surface inconveniently. No documented opinions about marriage that contradicted palace convenience. No prior history that could be excavated by tabloids. No demonstrated willingness to engage the press on her own terms and speak frankly about her inner life. No self that would need to be accommodated, explained, or managed. The list of what had disqualified Sarah Spencer was, in this light, effectively a reverse image description of those criteria. She had a personal history she was willing to discuss. She had stated what she required from a marriage. She had shown she could talk to Fleet Street without performing the required silence. She had, in one afternoon in Switzerland, revealed the existence of a person behind the title. The institution didn't issue a statement. It simply redirected its attention. Between early 1978 and the summer of 1980, 2 full years, Charles moved through the same aristocratic social world without settling on a bride candidate. Sarah Spencer married Neil Edmund McCorquodale on 17 May 1980 in Northamptonshire, roughly a year before Diana's wedding. Diana, meanwhile, continued to appear at the edge of Charles's social world in ways that would become significant only in retrospect. She was at Charles's 30th birthday party at Buckingham Palace in November 1978, attending alongside her sister. She was at a Sandringham shooting party as one of the Queen's weekend guests in January 1979. On some occasions afterward, Juner notes, Charles invited Diana to the ballet or to dinner with friends as part of a group. These encounters were, by Juner's assessment, purely platonic. Diana was fun to have around. He wasn't pursuing her. She was simply present, young and undemanding, in a world where being young and undemanding was quietly accumulating value. The moment the dynamic shifted was August 1979. Lord Mountbatten was murdered by the IRA on 27 August, when a bomb concealed in his boat detonated off the coast of Sligo. Mountbatten had been a crucial figure in Charles's life, mentor, model, the person whose advice on marriage Charles had reportedly heeded most closely. His death left Charles in what Juner describes as a fragile state. In the summer of 1980, Charles and Diana found themselves sitting together at a social occasion, and Diana turned to him and said, in words Juner quotes in her History Extra account, "My heart bled for you when I watched the funeral. I thought, it's wrong. You're lonely. You should be with somebody to look after you." Juner's assessment of why this worked is blunt. This was exactly what Charles needed to hear. He was in a fragile state at that point, and Diana really touched a nerve in Charles. She said just the right thing to him, at the right moment, and he was moved by her. He promptly invited her to Balmoral. September 1980. Diana travels to the northern reaches of Scotland for a summer holiday with Charles and a group of friends. The Balmoral test, as it had come to be understood in royal circles, was the informal proving ground where candidates were assessed for their ability to function in the family's preferred environment. Diana passed it comprehensively. She enchanted and delighted, per Juner. She was funny, she was fun, everybody seemed to love her. She made everyone laugh and she seemed to adore Charles. She seemed to be the perfect girl. Then Juner adds the sentence that carries the weight of the entire selection. She appeared to be very uncomplicated. That phrase is doing an enormous amount of work. Diana Spencer at 19 wasn't uncomplicated. She had a fractured childhood, parents separated when she was 6, her mother ultimately losing custody in a painful court case after her maternal grandmother gave evidence against her own daughter. Diana had been left feeling, as Juner summarizes from Diana's own accounts to Morton, very unloved and unwanted. She carried those feelings forward. She was, as Juner assesses, a very damaged little girl who had grown into a very damaged young woman. She would later struggle with bulimia. She would experience years of emotional turbulence inside a marriage whose internal structure she had not been given adequate information to understand before entering. What she appeared to be at Balmoral in September 1980 wasn't what she was. She appeared uncomplicated because she was 19, because she had not yet encountered the specific set of pressures that would surface her complications, and because she genuinely didn't know enough about what she was being considered for to present anything other than her natural warmth and enthusiasm. She appeared uncomplicated because she was naive. And naive, in the palace's assessment, was a qualification. The pressure on Charles to act was reaching its decisive point. In early 1981, Prince Philip sent his son a written memo. Junior's account of its contents is specific. "You either marry this girl or you let her go." Charles, according to Junior, misread the memo. He interpreted it as a direct order to marry Diana, rather than as his father's attempt to force a decision. Rather than just picking up the phone or having a chat face-to-face, it was all done through memos, Junior explains. Charles misread his father's memo. He thought he was being told that he must marry Diana, and so he asked her to marry him. Charles proposed to Diana in February 1981. She was 19 years old. He was 32. The age gap was 13 years. The engagement was announced publicly on 24 February 1981. The wedding was set for 29 July. By every documented measurement, Diana Spencer carried the same aristocratic credentials as her older sister. Same father, the 8th Earl Spencer, whose equerry service had given the family formal, documented access to 2 consecutive monarchs. Same bloodline, with its multiple lines of descent from the House of Stuart. Same Sandringham estate address. Same schools. Riddlesworth Hall, then West Heath. The Spencer name that a Berks peerage consultant would characterize as uniquely dense in royal connections ran through both sisters in the same unbroken line. What was different between them wasn't pedigree. It was everything that pedigree couldn't account for. Diana had no documented history of speaking frankly to the press about her inner life. She had no prior serious relationships on the public record. She had not sat at a cloister's lunch table and stated a personal principle about what she required from a marriage. She had not, in any documented context, demonstrated the kind of self-possession that signals to an institution that its terms are under negotiation. She was young enough, 6 years younger than Sarah, not to have developed that particular fluency. She had no armor against the role she was being offered, and no framework for understanding what the role actually required, because the institution had never given her enough access to see it clearly. Junior's language about Diana at Balmoral, apparently uncomplicated, fresh and naive, is the vocabulary of a selection process, not a romance. These were attributes the palace could work with. Freshness meant no past to excavate. Apparent simplicity meant no independent life that would resist being absorbed into the function. Naivete meant the performance of compliance that the institution needed could be maintained long enough to serve its purpose. Diana wasn't chosen in spite of her inexperience. The evidence, examined plainly, points toward the conclusion that she was chosen because of it. The comparison with her sister makes this legible. Sarah had been worldly enough to know what she thought and say it aloud. Diana was young enough not yet to know that the silence was compulsory. There is an additional dimension to what Diana was walking into that the palace chose not to disclose. Charles had not told her, before the engagement, about the history and nature of his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana discovered it, per Junior, through Buckingham Palace gossip. Junior's assessment of what this meant for a 19-year-old woman, she would have been hugely upset by that and very jealous. She probably felt like a bit of a fool. Diana later described her experience of the marriage in the recorded conversations she gave to Andrew Morton for Diana, Her True Story, published in 1992. She described being extracted from her London flat share at 19, installed in a suite of rooms at Buckingham Palace, and finding herself in a situation she had no preparation for. She became weepy and jealous. Her moods were volatile. The institution around her didn't know how to respond. Her husband didn't know how to respond. She wanted 101% of Charles's attention all the time, Juner concludes, and he was just not the man who would ever have been able to give that to her. In 1991, speaking into Andrew Morton's recording device, Diana put it directly, "I'm just a pawn pushed around by the powers that be." Charles, in the 1994 Dimbleby television documentary, admitted to infidelity. The Dimbleby biography describes a man who felt he had been pressured into marriage by his father, and who had entered the arrangement believing he could grow to love his wife. Juner is generous in her reading. "I think he thought he could grow to love her. Fundamentally, I think he had every intention of making his marriage work." The marriage's failure, in Juner's assessment, wasn't a planned betrayal. It was a catastrophic mismatch. These two people were just completely wrong for one another. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. Charles may have intended to make it work, and the institution that selected Diana may have been operating in ways that made the failure structurally probable from the outset. A 19-year-old without adequate knowledge of what she was agreeing to, selected in part because she appeared uncomplicated enough to absorb the role's demands, wasn't a recipe for a functioning marriage. She was a recipe for a functional arrangement. The two aren't the same thing. What happened to Sarah Spencer in the years that followed her Closter's lunch was quieter by almost every measure. She married Neil Edmund McCorquodale on 17 May 1980 at a ceremony in Northamptonshire. McCorquodale had been a guards officer. 3 children followed: Emily Jane, born in 1983, George Edmund, born in 1984, and Celia Rose, born in 1989. The family settled near Grantham in Lincolnshire. Sarah served a 1-year term as High Sheriff of Lincolnshire in 2009 and became a master of the Belvoir Hunt in May 2010. After Diana's death on 31 August 1997, Sarah flew to Paris with her sister Jane and Prince Charles to bring Diana's body home. She was a co-executor of Diana's will. She served for years as president of the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, which raised over £112 million for charitable causes before closing in 2012. Andrew Morton, who interviewed Diana extensively and knew the full weight of those relationships, called Sarah one of the few people Diana really trusted. In the later years of the princess's life, Sarah often accompanied her sister on official visits as one of her ladies-in-waiting. The contrast in outcomes is stated most cleanly by the bare facts. Diana Frances Spencer was born on 1 July 1961. She died on 31 August 1997 in a Paris underpass, aged 36. Elizabeth Sarah Lavinia Spencer was born on 19 March 1955, 6 years earlier than her sister, and the elder of the 2 women who passed through the same Windsor orbit with very different results. The 6-year gap between the sisters became, over the course of their lives, the distance between a woman who saw the terms of the arrangement early enough to decline them and a woman who agreed to terms she didn't fully understand. That distance was partly a matter of temperament, partly a matter of age, partly a matter of the specific experience that makes a woman capable of sitting at a lunch table and saying what she actually thinks. The closing argument of this story isn't primarily about Diana's marriage, which has been reconstructed in hundreds of books, 2 royal commissions, a famous BBC television confession, and a Netflix series watched by more people than watched Diana's wedding. The Diana narrative is complete, over-examined, and thoroughly available. This is a different story. The palace that selected Diana Spencer in 1981 had already encountered Lady Sarah Spencer and found her unsuitable. The reason it found her unsuitable reveals the actual criteria operating beneath the public ones. It wasn't that she lacked the bloodline. The Spencer family's royal connections were, by any measure, exceptional. Stiff with royal connections in the assessment of a Berks peerage specialist in a way that couldn't be said of most aristocratic families of the period. It wasn't that she lacked the relevant affiliations. Her father had served as personal equerry to 2 consecutive monarchs. She had the Queen Mother as a godparent. She had the right schools, the right title, the right address. What she lacked, what disqualified her in the informal calculus of the vetting process, was the inability to be herself quietly. She had opinions about marriage she would state aloud. She had a history she would discuss. She had the kind of presence that does not disappear into a function, that continues to assert its own requirements even when institutional pressure suggests it shouldn't. The palace recoiled from that. It moved on to find a candidate who appeared not to have that problem. It found a girl 6 years younger, from the same family, with the same bloodline and the same schools and the same aristocratic credentials, but without the worldly self-possession her older sister had developed. Diana appeared uncomplicated. She appeared fresh and naive and full of the joys of life, in Juner's precise words. She appeared to adore Charles. She appeared not to know that the silence was compulsory because no one had yet required it of her, and she had not yet had occasion to test her own response. The institution didn't want a partner for Charles. It wanted a cover. A woman who could stand beside him at state occasions, produce the required heirs, and perform the marriage without surfacing the emotional reality underneath it. The vetting process had been designed, or had evolved, which amounts to the same thing, to identify candidates whose youth and inexperience would serve as structural guarantees of compliance. Sarah Spencer was too experienced. She knew what she thought. She said it. Diana Spencer was 19 years old and had met the man she was about to marry only a handful of times. The palace called it a perfect match. What it actually was, on the evidence, was a perfect selection. A woman young enough to mistake the institution's attention for affection, inexperienced enough not to recognize the terms of the arrangement she was entering, and without the armor that her older sister had already demonstrated was necessary and already demonstrated would disqualify her. Sarah saw the trap and stepped over it. The palace looked for someone who couldn't see it yet, and the Spencer family produced the candidate. The younger sister, 6 years less experienced, standing in the same ancestral home where Charles had first noticed her during a visit to her older sister in November 1977. He had come to Althorp for Sarah. He found Diana by accident. The accident, in retrospect, was the institution's design. Subscribe for more stories like this.